The rain hammered against the windows of the old warehouse as Marcus sat in the corner, his knuckles bloodied from another session with the heavy bag. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil that had been eating away at him for months. His business had collapsed, his marriage had ended, and the friends he thought he could count on had disappeared one by one. But tonight was different. Tonight he had made a decision that would change everything. Pain had become his teacher, and he was ready to learn its darkest lessons. This is not a story about masochism or self-destruction. This is an exploration of one of humanity's most controversial paths to emotional mastery, the deliberate use of pain as a catalyst for psychological transformation. It's a journey that challenges every comfortable assumption about healing, growth, and the nature of strength itself. What you're about to discover may disturb you, inspire you, or perhaps both. But one thing is certain: it will force you to confront the uncomfortable truth about what it really takes to achieve unshakable emotional control. The philosophy is ancient, found in the teachings of Stoics, the practices of warrior cultures, and the wisdom of mystics who understood that sometimes the only way out is through. But in our modern world of safe spaces and trigger warnings, we've forgotten this fundamental truth. Pain, when properly harnessed, can become the most powerful tool for psychological development ever discovered. Part 1. The Anatomy of Emotional Weakness. Marcus discovered the truth about weakness during his lowest moment. Sitting in that warehouse, watching his breath fog in the cold air, he realized that everything he had considered strength was actually elaborate emotional armor, protective mechanisms that had made him increasingly vulnerable to the very things he was trying to avoid. The modern world teaches us to avoid pain at all costs. We medicate discomfort, distract ourselves from difficulty, and create elaborate support systems designed to shield us from anything that might cause psychological distress. But this approach has created a generation of emotionally fragile individuals who crumble at the first sign of genuine hardship. We've confused comfort with strength, and in doing so, we've made ourselves incredibly vulnerable to the inevitable sufferings that life will bring. Real emotional weakness isn't about feeling pain. It's about being controlled by the fear of pain. When Marcus looked back at his failed business, he realized that every crucial decision he had made was influenced not by logic or vision, but by his desperate need to avoid discomfort. He had avoided difficult conversations with employees, postponed hard decisions about the company's direction, and chosen the path of least resistance at every turn. His emotional weakness hadn't just cost him his business, it had cost him his self-respect. The truth about weakness is that it's not a character flaw. It's a learned response to a world that has taught us that pain is always the enemy. We develop elaborate coping mechanisms designed to help us avoid, minimize, or escape from any form of psychological discomfort. These mechanisms become so automatic that we don't even realize how much they control our lives. We choose careers based on what feels safe rather than what excites us. We stay in relationships that are slowly killing us because the pain of leaving seems worse than the pain of staying. We avoid taking risks, speaking our truth, or pursuing our dreams because we've become addicted to the illusion of emotional safety. But here's what Marcus learned in that warehouse. Emotional safety is an illusion. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional, but only if you're willing to face it head-on and transform it into something useful. The weak self is the version of you that has been carefully constructed to avoid pain. It's the collection of habits, beliefs, and behaviors that you've developed to keep yourself comfortable. This weak self might be successful by conventional standards. It might have a good job, a nice house, and a respectable reputation. But it's built on a foundation of fear, and fear-based structures are always unstable. Marcus realized that his weak self had been running his life for years. It was the part of him that smiled when he wanted to scream, that agreed when he wanted to object, that compromised his values to maintain the approval of others. It was the version of himself that had convinced him that being liked was more important than being respected, that being comfortable was more important than being authentic, and that avoiding conflict was more important than standing for something meaningful. The weak self is not evil, it's just terrified. It's the psychological equivalent of an overprotective parent who keeps a child locked inside to protect them from the dangers of the world. But just as physical strength can only be developed through resistance training, emotional strength can only be developed through exposure to controlled stress and discomfort. When Marcus began to understand this, he realized that all of his previous attempts at self-improvement had been misguided. He had been trying to strengthen his weak self to make it more confident and resilient. But you can't build a strong foundation on weak ground. The weak self had to be destroyed before the strong self could emerge. This destruction isn't violent or dramatic. It's methodical and intentional. It's the process of systematically identifying and dismantling the protective mechanisms that have been keeping you small. It's about learning to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to escape from it. It's about choosing the difficult path when the easy one is available. It's about saying what you mean, even when it makes others uncomfortable. It's about pursuing what matters to you, even when success isn't guaranteed. The process begins with radical honesty about your own patterns of avoidance. Marcus spent weeks cataloging all the ways he avoided discomfort, the meetings he postponed, the conversations he avoided, the decisions he delayed. He realized that his entire life had been organized around avoiding pain, and this avoidance had made him incredibly vulnerable to it. But acknowledging the pattern isn't enough. The weak self is cunning and will find new ways to maintain control. It will convince you that you're making progress when you're actually just developing more sophisticated forms of avoidance. It will tell you that you need to be gentle with yourself, that change should feel good, that growth should be comfortable. These are lies designed to keep you trapped in familiar patterns. The truth is that real growth feels like dying. It feels like everything you thought you knew about yourself is being stripped away. It feels dangerous because it is dangerous. Dangerous to the weak self that has been calling the shots for so long. But danger to the weak self is opportunity for the strong self. Marcus learned that the weak self dies hard. It will fight for survival using every weapon in its arsenal: guilt, shame, fear, rationalization, and distraction. It will tell you stories about why you can't change, why you don't deserve better, why the risk is too great. It will recruit other people to support its narrative, finding friends and family members who are invested in keeping you the same because your weakness makes them feel better about their own. But the weak self has a fatal flaw. It can't survive exposure to sustained discomfort. It's like a vampire that can't tolerate sunlight. When you consistently choose discomfort over comfort, difficulty over ease, truth over lies, the weak self begins to wither. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it gradually loses its power to control your decisions and shape your reality. This is why pain becomes such a powerful ally in the process of transformation. Not just any pain. Random suffering accomplishes nothing. But deliberate, chosen, purposeful discomfort becomes a weapon that can be used to destroy the weak self and clear the ground for something stronger to emerge. Marcus discovered that there are 3 types of pain that are particularly effective in this process: physical pain that builds mental toughness, social pain that builds authentic character, and psychological pain that builds emotional resilience. Each type serves a specific function in the destruction of the weak self. Physical pain teaches you that your body can endure far more than your mind believes possible. When Marcus began training seriously, pushing himself past his comfort zone in the gym, he discovered that his perception of his own limitations was largely illusory. The weak self had convinced him that he was fragile, that he needed to protect himself from strain and stress, but controlled physical stress revealed that he was actually far more durable than he had imagined. Social pain teaches you that other people's opinions have only the power you give them. When Marcus began speaking his truth instead of saying what others wanted to hear, he experienced the temporary discomfort of disapproval and conflict. But he also discovered that his worth was not dependent on external validation. The weak self had made him addicted to approval, but social pain broke that addiction and revealed his intrinsic value. Psychological pain teaches you that emotions are temporary weather patterns, not permanent states. When Marcus stopped avoiding difficult feelings and learned to sit with them instead, he discovered that even the most intense emotional states would eventually pass. The weak self had convinced him that certain feelings were unbearable, but psychological pain revealed that he could bear anything for a limited time. The key insight is that pain is not the problem. Your relationship with pain is the problem. The weak self is terrified of pain because it doesn't understand its purpose. But when you learn to use pain as a tool for growth rather than seeing it as something to be avoided, it becomes one of your most valuable allies. This doesn't mean seeking pain for its own sake or glorifying suffering. It means developing a different relationship with the inevitable discomforts that come with any meaningful life. It means choosing short-term pain for long-term gain instead of short-term comfort for long-term regret. It means understanding that the only way to build emotional muscle is through emotional resistance training. Marcus realized that every hero's journey in literature and mythology follows the same pattern. The protagonist must face their greatest fears, endure their darkest moments, and be stripped of everything they thought they needed in order to discover who they really are. The weak self must die for the hero to be born. This isn't just a storytelling device. It's a psychological truth that has been recognized across cultures and throughout history. But in our modern world, we've tried to rewrite this ancient wisdom. We've convinced ourselves that growth should be comfortable, that change should be easy, and that we can become stronger without ever being tested. This is not just misguided, it's impossible. Strength is built through resistance, courage is built through fear, and wisdom is built through suffering. The weak self is not your enemy, it's simply a tool that has outlived its usefulness. It served a purpose when you were young and genuinely vulnerable. But if you want to live a life of meaning and power, if you want to create something significant and leave a lasting impact, then the weak self must be retired. And the only way to retire it is to systematically expose it to the very things it has been trying to avoid. This exposure must be gradual and intentional. You don't jump into the deep end of psychological transformation. You wade in slowly, building your tolerance for discomfort one challenge at a time. You start with small acts of courage, having a difficult conversation, setting a boundary, saying no to something you don't want to do. You build your emotional strength the same way you would build physical strength, through progressive overload and consistent practice. As Marcus sat in that warehouse, he understood that the next phase of his life would require him to become someone completely different, not through positive thinking or self-affirmation, but through the systematic destruction of every weak pattern that had been controlling his life. He would have to learn to use pain as a tool, discomfort as a teacher, and resistance as a pathway to strength. The weak self would fight this process every step of the way. It would offer compelling reasons to quit, to go back to the familiar patterns of avoidance and comfort. But Marcus had glimpsed something that made the struggle worthwhile. The possibility of becoming unshakable, of developing the kind of emotional strength that could weather any storm. This wasn't about becoming numb or indifferent to pain. It was about developing such a strong relationship with discomfort that external circumstances could no longer dictate his internal state. It was about becoming the kind of person who could face any challenge without flinching, who could pursue any goal without being paralyzed by the fear of failure, who could speak any truth without being silenced by the fear of rejection. The anatomy of emotional weakness is complex, but its cure is simple. Exposure to controlled stress that systematically dismantles fear-based patterns and builds genuine resilience. The question is not whether you're capable of this transformation. Everyone is. The question is whether you're willing to endure the temporary discomfort required to achieve permanent strength. Marcus stood up from the concrete floor, his body aching from the workout, his mind clear about the path ahead. The weak self was still there, still whispering its familiar fears and doubts. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't listening. He was ready to begin the process of using pain to gain emotional control, to destroy the weak version of himself that had been holding him back, and to build something stronger in its place. The rain had stopped, but the real storm was just beginning. Part 2. The Alchemy of Pain Transformation. 3 months after that night in the warehouse, Marcus had learned that there's a vast difference between suffering and transformation. Pain, he discovered, is raw material. It's what you do with it that determines whether it becomes poison or medicine. The alchemy of pain transformation requires both understanding and technique, both wisdom and courage. Most importantly, it requires the willingness to do what most people will never do: stay present with discomfort long enough for it to teach you its secrets. The first lesson in pain transformation is learning to distinguish between useful pain and useless pain. Not all suffering serves growth. Random trauma, unprocessed grief, and purposeless hardship can destroy rather than build. But chosen pain, discomfort that is deliberately engaged for specific developmental purposes, becomes a powerful tool for psychological evolution. Marcus began experimenting with cold exposure, spending increasingly longer periods in ice-cold showers, and eventually graduating to ice baths. The physical shock to his system was intense, but it taught him something profound about his relationship with discomfort. His initial response was always the same: panic, resistance, and an overwhelming urge to escape. But when he forced himself to stay present with the sensation, to breathe through it instead of fighting it, something remarkable happened. The pain didn't disappear, but his relationship with it transformed completely. He realized that most of the suffering associated with pain comes not from the sensation itself, but from the mental story we tell ourselves about the sensation. The mind creates elaborate narratives about why the pain is unbearable, how long it will last, and what it means about our ability to cope. But when you strip away the story and focus purely on the physical sensation, pain becomes much more manageable. This principle extends far beyond physical discomfort. Emotional pain follows the same pattern. The actual feeling of rejection, disappointment, or failure is temporary and manageable. But the stories we tell ourselves about these feelings are not good enough. I'll never succeed. Everyone will abandon me. Create suffering that can last for years. Marcus began practicing what he called pain meditation, deliberately exposing himself to various forms of controlled discomfort while maintaining complete present moment awareness. He would sit in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, focusing entirely on the physical sensations without trying to change or escape them. He would engage in difficult conversations while paying attention to the anxiety and fear that arose, observing these feelings without being controlled by them. Through this practice, he discovered that pain has its own intelligence. When you stop fighting it and start listening to it, pain becomes a teacher that can provide insights unavailable through any other means. Physical pain teaches you about your body's capabilities and limitations. Emotional pain teaches you about your values, boundaries, and authentic desires. Social pain teaches you about your relationship patterns and attachment styles. But the transformation process requires more than just exposure to pain. It requires active engagement with it. This is where the weak self proves most cunning. It will allow you to experience pain if it can convince you that you're a victim of it. Being a victim of pain is very different from being an alchemist of pain. Victims are passive. They endure suffering without extracting value from it. Alchemists are active. They engage with pain deliberately and transform it into strength. The victim mentality around pain is seductive because it provides a sense of identity and often garners sympathy from others. Look how much I've suffered becomes a badge of honor rather than fuel for transformation. But this approach keeps you stuck in patterns of weakness because it frames pain as something that happens to you rather than something you can learn to work with. Marcus had to confront his own victim tendencies. For years, he had worn his suffering-like armor, using his difficult past as an excuse for his present limitations. Of course I have trust issues. Look what I went through. Of course I avoid risk. I've been hurt before. These stories weren't entirely false, but they were keeping him trapped in reactive patterns rather than empowering him to create new realities. The shift from victim to alchemist begins with taking radical responsibility for your relationship with pain. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for bad things that have happened to you. It means recognizing that while you can't control what happens to you, you have complete control over what you do with those experiences. Marcus developed a systematic approach to pain transformation that he practiced daily. First, he would identify areas of his life where he was avoiding necessary discomfort. These might be difficult conversations he was postponing, goals he was afraid to pursue, or truths he was afraid to acknowledge. Second, he would deliberately engage with these uncomfortable situations while maintaining present moment awareness of his physical and emotional responses. Third, he would extract specific lessons from each experience, asking himself what the pain was trying to teach him about his patterns, limitations, or growth areas. This process revealed something profound. Most of the pain he had been avoiding was far less intense and lasting than his imagination had made it seem. The anticipatory anxiety was almost always worse than the actual experience. His mind had been holding him hostage with threats that proved to be largely empty. But the transformation process isn't just about facing individual instances of pain. It's about fundamentally rewiring your nervous system's response to stress and discomfort. The weak self operates from a place of chronic hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and preparing to avoid or escape from anything that might cause pain. This creates a stress response that is exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. The strong self, by contrast, operates from a place of confident calm. It doesn't seek out pain, but it doesn't fear it either. It understands that some degree of discomfort is inevitable in any meaningful life, and has developed the skills to work with that discomfort effectively. This creates a completely different way of moving through the world, one characterized by boldness rather than caution, authenticity rather than people-pleasing, and growth rather than protection. Marcus discovered that physical training was one of the most effective ways to rewire his nervous system. Not just any physical training, but training that deliberately pushed him past his comfort zone in controlled ways. Weightlifting taught him about progressive overload, the principle that growth requires gradually increasing stress. Martial arts taught him about staying calm under pressure and using his opponent's energy against them. Endurance activities taught him about mental resilience and the ability to continue when every instinct is telling you to quit. But perhaps the most powerful form of training was learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in social situations. The weak self had made Marcus incredibly sensitive to social disapproval. He would modify his behavior, his opinions, and even his goals based on what he thought others would think of him. This social anxiety had become a prison that kept him from expressing his authentic self. Marcus began deliberately putting himself in situations that triggered social anxiety. He would speak his truth in groups where he knew his opinions would be unpopular. He would set boundaries with people who were used to him being accommodating. He would pursue goals that others thought were unrealistic or inappropriate for someone in his situation. The initial discomfort was intense. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to back down, to apologize, to return to the familiar patterns of people-pleasing. But he forced himself to stay present with the anxiety, to feel it fully without being controlled by it. Gradually, he discovered that other people's disapproval couldn't actually hurt him unless he gave it the power to do so. This social pain transformation was perhaps the most liberating aspect of the entire process. When you're no longer controlled by the fear of what others might think, you become capable of authentic self-expression and genuine leadership. You can make decisions based on your values rather than your fears. You can pursue goals that excite you rather than goals that others approve of. You can speak truths that need to be spoken rather than just saying what people want to hear. But the transformation process isn't linear and it's never complete. The weak self doesn't disappear, it just loses its power to control your decisions. It will still whisper its familiar fears and doubts, especially when you're tired, stressed, or facing particularly challenging situations. The difference is that you learn to recognize these voices without being controlled by them. Marcus developed what he called pain protocols, specific strategies for working with different types of discomfort. For physical pain, he used breathing techniques and present moment awareness to stay calm and centered. For emotional pain, he used journaling and self-inquiry to extract lessons and insights. For social pain, he used affirmations and value-based decision-making to stay true to his authentic self. These protocols weren't about eliminating pain. They were about transforming his relationship with it. Pain stopped being the enemy and became a neutral force that could be worked with skillfully. This shift in perspective changed everything about how he moved through the world. The alchemy of pain transformation also requires understanding the difference between acute pain and chronic pain. Acute pain is temporary and serves a specific purpose. It signals danger, motivates change, or teaches important lessons. Chronic pain, whether physical or emotional, is different. It's pain that has lost its informational value and become a habit pattern that no longer serves growth. Marcus had been carrying chronic emotional pain from his failed marriage and business for years. This wasn't the productive pain of growth. It was the destructive pain of rumination and self-pity. Learning to distinguish between these types of pain was crucial for his transformation process. Chronic pain requires a different approach than acute pain. Rather than leaning into it, you need to learn to release it. This often involves forgiveness. Not because the other person deserves it, but because carrying resentment is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Marcus had to forgive his ex-wife, his former business partners, and most importantly, himself for the failures and mistakes of the past. This forgiveness process was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation. The weak self was attached to these old wounds because they provided a sense of identity and justified certain limitations. I can't trust people because of what she did to me. I can't take risks because of how badly I failed before. These stories felt true and important, but they were keeping him trapped in the past. Forgiveness, Marcus learned, isn't about condoning what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about releasing the emotional charge around past events so that they can't continue to control your present choices. It's about choosing freedom over resentment, possibility over limitation, growth over stagnation. The transformation process accelerated when Marcus began sharing his journey with others, not in a way that sought sympathy or validation, but in a way that modeled possibility and strength. He discovered that vulnerability, when expressed from a place of strength rather than weakness, becomes incredibly powerful. This wasn't the performative vulnerability that has become popular in our therapeutic culture, where sharing your trauma becomes a way of avoiding responsibility for your life. This was authentic, strength-based sharing that inspired others to begin their own transformation journeys. Marcus found that teaching others what he had learned deepened his own understanding and commitment to the process. When you help someone else transform their relationship with pain, you strengthen your own transformation. When you model courage for others, you reinforce your own courage. The alchemy of pain transformation is ultimately about learning to extract gold from dross, to find the gift hidden within every challenge, to transform what could destroy you into what makes you stronger. It's an ancient practice that has been forgotten in our comfort-obsessed culture, but it's more necessary now than ever. In a world that teaches us to avoid, medicate, or distract ourselves from any form of discomfort, learning to work skillfully with pain becomes a superpower. It allows you to pursue meaningful goals without being paralyzed by the fear of failure. It allows you to build authentic relationships without being controlled by the fear of rejection. It allows you to speak your truth without being silenced by the fear of disapproval. But perhaps most importantly, it allows you to become the person you were meant to be before fear convinced you to settle for less. The strong self that emerges from this process isn't hard or callous, it's actually more open and loving than the weak self ever was. But its love comes from abundance rather than neediness. Its openness comes from strength rather than desperation. And its compassion comes from wisdom rather than naivety. As Marcus looked back on his transformation journey, he realized that the pain had been the most valuable teacher he had ever encountered, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he had learned to extract maximum value from inevitable discomfort. Every setback had become a setup for a comeback. Every failure had become a lesson in resilience. Every rejection had become an opportunity to strengthen his sense of self-worth. The weak self that had once controlled his life was still there, but it had been relegated to its proper place, as a voice of caution that could provide information without controlling decisions. The strong self was now in charge, and it made choices based on possibility rather than fear, on growth rather than safety, on authenticity rather than approval. This transformation had taken months of consistent practice, but the results were worth every moment of discomfort. Marcus had become unshakable, not because nothing could hurt him, but because he knew he could handle whatever came his way. He had developed what the ancient Stoics called the discipline of desire, the ability to want what happens rather than expecting what he wanted to happen. The alchemy of pain transformation continues to evolve and deepen over time. It's not a destination you reach, but a way of traveling through life. Every new challenge becomes an opportunity to practice and refine these skills. Every setback becomes raw material for further growth. Every moment of discomfort becomes a chance to demonstrate to yourself that you are stronger than your circumstances. Marcus understood now why ancient warriors and mystics had always known this secret. The person who learns to transform pain into power becomes unstoppable, not because they never experience difficulty, but because they have developed the ability to extract value from any experience. They have become alchemists of their own lives, capable of transforming any base metal of suffering into the gold of wisdom and strength. Part 3. The Invincible Self, Beyond the Reach of Destruction. 6 months after beginning his transformation, Marcus discovered something that both terrified and liberated him. When you truly destroy the weak parts of yourself, what remains cannot be touched by external circumstances. The person who has learned to transform pain into power, who has systematically dismantled their fear-based patterns, who has built their identity on internal rather than external foundations, becomes functionally invincible, not because nothing can harm them, but because nothing can define them. This invincibility isn't what most people imagine it to be. It's not the cartoon superhero fantasy of being immune to damage. It's something far more profound. The development of an unshakable core identity that remains stable regardless of what's happening in the external world. When you no longer need certain outcomes to feel valuable, when you no longer require other people's approval to feel worthy, when you no longer avoid challenges to feel safe, you become incredibly difficult to manipulate, control, or destroy. Marcus first experienced this during a business meeting where he was being pressured to compromise his principles for a lucrative deal. The old version of himself would have agonized over the decision, weighing the financial benefits against his ethical concerns, probably eventually capitulating because he needed the money and feared the consequences of walking away. But this new version of himself felt something he had never experienced before: complete clarity about what he would and wouldn't do, regardless of the consequences. He said no, not apologetically or defensively, but calmly and definitively. When the other party tried to pressure him, threatened to take their business elsewhere, and questioned his business sense, Marcus felt no internal disturbance. Their approval or disapproval simply had no power over his sense of self-worth or his decision-making process. For the first time in his life, he was operating from a place of genuine strength rather than compensated weakness. This is what the ancient Stoics understood. Freedom comes not from getting what you want, but from not needing what you don't have. When your happiness, self-worth, and sense of identity are not dependent on external circumstances, you become liberated from the fear that drives most human behavior. You can take risks because you're not attached to specific outcomes. You can speak truth because you're not afraid of rejection. You can pursue authentic goals because you're not seeking validation. The process of building this internal fortress requires understanding the difference between conditional and unconditional self-worth. Most people operate with conditional self-worth. Their sense of value depends on their achievements, their relationships, their financial status, their physical appearance, or other external factors. This creates an incredibly fragile foundation for identity because external factors are always subject to change. Unconditional self-worth, by contrast, is based on the simple fact of your existence and your potential for growth and contribution. It doesn't fluctuate based on circumstances, and it can't be taken away by other people or external events. Building this kind of self-worth requires systematically disconnecting your identity from your outcomes and reconnecting it to your character and your commitment to growth. Marcus achieved this by developing what he called identity independence, the ability to maintain a stable sense of self regardless of what was happening in his life. This required identifying all the ways his identity had been dependent on external factors and systematically building independence in each area. His identity had been tied to his business success, so he learned to define himself as an entrepreneur and creator rather than as a successful business owner. His identity had been tied to his marriage, so he learned to define himself as a whole person rather than as half of a couple. His identity had been tied to others' approval, so he learned to define himself based on his values and actions rather than on others' opinions. This process of identity independence was challenging because it required letting go of many of the things he had previously used to feel good about himself. But it was also incredibly liberating because it freed him from the constant anxiety of trying to maintain external conditions that were ultimately outside his control. The invincible self that emerges from this process has several key characteristics that make it extraordinarily resilient. First, it operates from abundance rather than scarcity. Because its sense of worth isn't dependent on external validation, it doesn't need to compete with others or hoard resources. It can be generous with praise, support, and opportunities because it doesn't feel threatened by others' success. Second, the invincible self is comfortable with uncertainty. Because it doesn't need specific outcomes to feel secure, it can navigate ambiguous situations without anxiety. It can take calculated risks, try new approaches, and enter unfamiliar territories because its sense of security comes from within, rather than from external predictability. Third, the invincible self is resistant to manipulation. Because it doesn't need others' approval to feel valuable, it can't be controlled through guilt, shame, or social pressure. It makes decisions based on its own values and goals rather than on what others expect or demand. Marcus discovered that this resistance to manipulation extended beyond obvious attempts at control. He became immune to the subtle social pressures that influence most people's behavior. The pressure to keep up with others financially, to conform to social expectations about lifestyle and career choices, to avoid offending anyone or standing out too much. These pressures had previously shaped many of his decisions without him even realizing it. The invincible self also has a unique relationship with failure and setbacks. Because its identity isn't dependent on success, failure becomes simply information rather than a threat to self-worth. This allows for much more aggressive goal setting and risk-taking because the downside is limited to practical consequences rather than identity destruction. When Marcus's next business venture failed after 8 months, his response was completely different from his previous business failure. Instead of spiral into self-doubt and depression, he immediately began analyzing what had gone wrong, what he had learned, and how he could apply those lessons to future endeavors. The failure was disappointing, but it wasn't devastating because his sense of worth wasn't riding on the outcome. This relationship with failure creates a powerful feedback loop. When you're not afraid of failure, you can take bigger risks and pursue more ambitious goals. When you take bigger risks, you gain more experience and develop greater capabilities. When you develop greater capabilities, you become more likely to achieve significant success. Paradoxically, becoming comfortable with failure makes you much more likely to succeed. But perhaps the most important characteristic of the invincible self is its capacity for authentic connection. The weak self, despite its people-pleasing tendencies, actually has great difficulty forming deep relationships because it can't be authentic. It's too busy managing others' perceptions and avoiding conflict to show up as its real self. The invincible self, by contrast, can afford to be genuine because it's not dependent on others' approval. Marcus found that as he became more emotionally independent, his relationships actually became deeper and more satisfying. He could have difficult conversations without losing his center. He could set boundaries without feeling guilty. He could express his true thoughts and feelings without fear of rejection. This authenticity attracted higher quality people into his life and repelled those who were only interested in what they could get from him. The development of the invincible self also requires mastering what Marcus called emotional sovereignty, the ability to choose your emotional state rather than having it dictated by external circumstances. This isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending to feel differently than you do. It's about understanding that emotions are information, not commands, and that you have the power to work with them skillfully rather than being controlled by them. Emotional sovereignty develops through consistent practice of feeling difficult emotions without immediately trying to change or escape them. When Marcus felt anger, instead of either suppressing it or acting on it impulsively, he would sit with the sensation and explore what it was trying to tell him about his boundaries or values. When he felt fear, instead of avoiding the source of the fear or pretending he wasn't afraid, he would examine what the fear was protecting and whether that protection was still necessary. This practice gradually shifted his relationship with emotions from reactive to responsive. Instead of being hijacked by strong feelings, he learned to use them as information for making conscious choices about how to proceed. This emotional sovereignty became one of the most powerful aspects of his invincibility because it meant that other people could no longer control his internal state through their words or actions. The invincible self also develops what could be called anti-fragility, the ability to grow stronger from stresses rather than just surviving them. This concept, popularized by Nassim Taleb, describes systems that don't just resist damage but actually improve when subjected to stress. The human psyche, when properly developed, exhibits this quality. Marcus discovered this anti-fragility in himself when he was falsely accused of unethical business practices by a competitor. Instead of being devastated by the attack on his reputation, he used the situation to clarify his values, strengthen his ethical practices, and build stronger relationships with people who knew his character. The attack that was meant to destroy him actually made him stronger and more successful. This anti-fragile quality develops naturally when you've done the work of destroying the weak self and building the strong self. Because your identity isn't dependent on maintaining a particular image or avoiding certain experiences, challenges become opportunities for growth, rather than threats to be defended against. Building the invincible self requires understanding the difference between strength and hardness. Many people, when they first begin working with pain and difficulty, make the mistake of trying to become hard and unfeeling. They armor themselves against pain by becoming numb and disconnected, but this creates brittleness rather than strength. True invincibility is more like water than like rock. Water is incredibly powerful not because it's hard, but because it's flexible and persistent. It flows around obstacles, adapts to any container, and can wear away the hardest substances through patient persistence. The invincible self has this water-like quality. It's flexible enough to adapt to any circumstance, but persistent enough to maintain its essential nature. Marcus learned to cultivate this flexibility through practices that maintained his openness while strengthening his core. He practiced expressing vulnerability from a place of strength, showing compassion without enabling weakness, and maintaining boundaries without becoming rigid. This required constant attention to the balance between strength and openness, between self-protection and authentic connection. The invincible self is also characterized by what Marcus called outcome independence, the ability to pursue goals intensely while remaining unattached to specific results. This isn't about not caring or not trying. It's about putting your best effort toward meaningful goals while accepting that the final outcome is influenced by factors beyond your control. This outcome independence liberates tremendous energy that was previously tied up in anxiety about results. When you're not constantly worrying about whether you'll achieve your goals, you can focus entirely on the process of pursuing them. This focus on process over outcome often leads to better results. But more importantly, it creates a much more enjoyable and sustainable way of working toward what you want. Marcus applied this principle to everything from business ventures to romantic relationships. He would pursue opportunities wholeheartedly while remaining open to unexpected outcomes. This approach allowed him to take risks he wouldn't have taken before and to remain resilient when things didn't go as planned. The development of the invincible self is not a destination but an ongoing practice. Even after months of transformation, Marcus continued to encounter situations that challenged his emotional sovereignty and tested his independence from external validation. But each challenge became an opportunity to strengthen these qualities further. He developed what he called invincibility maintenance practices, daily habits that reinforced his emotional independence and strengthened his core identity. These included physical training that pushed his comfort zones, meditation practices that cultivated present moment awareness, journaling exercises that clarified his values and goals, and deliberate exposure to small challenges that maintained his tolerance for discomfort. Perhaps the most important aspect of maintaining invincibility is continuing to grow and challenge yourself. The invincible self isn't static. It's constantly evolving and expanding its capabilities. Stagnation leads to weakness, even for the strongest person. Marcus committed to lifelong learning and growth, always seeking new challenges that would test and develop his character. The invincible self also has a responsibility to use its strength in service of something greater than itself. Power without purpose becomes destructive, even self-destructive. Marcus found that as he became stronger, he naturally wanted to use that strength to help others develop their own invincibility. He began mentoring other entrepreneurs, sharing the principles and practices that had transformed his life. This service orientation is crucial for maintaining psychological health as you develop greater internal strength. When your own needs are met through internal resources, you naturally begin to focus on contributing to others' growth and well-being. This creates a positive feedback loop, where helping others grow strengthens your own development. The invincible self that Marcus had become was not the person who had started this journey 6 months earlier. The weak, approval-seeking, pain-avoiding version of himself had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something far more resilient and authentic. But this transformation hadn't made him cold or disconnected. It had actually made him more capable of genuine warmth and connection because he was no longer operating from a place of neediness or fear. The man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others because there's nothing left in him that depends on external circumstances for its existence. His worth comes from within. His security comes from his capability to handle whatever arises. His happiness comes from his alignment with his values rather than his achievement of specific outcomes. His strength comes from his willingness to face rather than avoid life's inevitable challenges. This doesn't mean that nothing can hurt him. Pain, loss, and disappointment are still part of the human experience. But these experiences no longer have the power to devastate him or define him. They become information, learning opportunities, and chances to demonstrate his resilience rather than threats to his core identity. As Marcus stood in his new office, looking out at the city where he had once felt so defeated and powerless, he marveled at how completely his inner world had transformed. The external circumstances of his life had improved dramatically. His new business was thriving, his relationships were deeper and more authentic, and his health was better than it had been in years. But more importantly, these improvements felt stable because they were built on a foundation of internal strength rather than external luck. The dark truth about using pain to gain emotional control had revealed itself to be not dark at all, but luminous with possibility. Pain, when approached with wisdom and courage, becomes the most powerful catalyst for growth available to human beings. The willingness to face difficulty, to sit with discomfort, to choose the harder path when it leads toward authenticity and strength. These choices create a kind of person who cannot be broken because they have already broken themselves open and reconstructed themselves from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. The invincible self is not a fantasy or an impossible ideal. It's a natural outcome of doing the difficult work of psychological development that most people avoid. It's available to anyone willing to destroy their weak self and build something stronger in its place. It's the birthright of every human being, waiting to be claimed through the courage to face pain rather than flee from it. Marcus had become living proof that the ancient wisdom was true. The person who conquers himself is mightier than the person who conquers cities. In learning to transform pain into power, fear into fuel, and weakness into strength, he had achieved something that no external force could take away from him. He had become unshakable, not because his life was free from challenge, but because he had developed the internal resources to transform any challenge into opportunity. The journey continues, each day bringing new opportunities to practice these principles and deepen this transformation. But the foundation has been laid, the core has been strengthened, and the invincible self stands ready to face whatever life may bring. In the end, this is the greatest gift that pain can offer. The opportunity to discover just how strong you really are when you stop running from who you're meant to become. The weak self had died in that warehouse 6 months ago. What emerged from its ashes was something far more valuable. A human being who had learned to use life's inevitable difficulties as raw material for building unshakable strength, authentic character, and genuine invincibility. The transformation was complete, but the growth would never end. Epilogue. The continuing practice years later, Marcus would look back on that night in the warehouse as the moment his real life began. Not because everything became easy from that point forward, but because he had learned the secret that changes everything. How to transform poison into medicine, lead into gold, weakness into strength. The practices he developed during those crucial months of transformation became the foundation for a life of extraordinary resilience and authentic power. He built multiple successful businesses, developed meaningful relationships, and contributed to the growth of countless other people. But more importantly, he maintained the unshakable core that had been forged through his willingness to face pain rather than flee from it. The dark truth about using pain to gain emotional control turned out to be the brightest truth of all, that human beings have an unlimited capacity for growth when they stop trying to avoid the very experiences that could make them stronger. In a world that teaches us to seek comfort above all else, the person who learns to find strength in struggle becomes truly free. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already done the hardest work himself. He has faced his deepest fears, transformed his greatest weaknesses, and built his identity on the unshakable foundation of conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. This is the path available to anyone willing to walk it. The only question is whether you have the courage to begin.